All right, kiddos, today we're going to do lesson 2.07, Evidence for Evolution, the second part, part 2. And we are going to talk about how scientists use DNA to support the theory of evolution. So what you can see here is a kind of a blurb from your course itself. It was really well written, so I want to go ahead and take a look at that with you. I'll read that for you. It says comparative DNA evidence, in other words, comparing DNA of different organisms, supports the theory of evolution. Evolution operates the level of a population's gene frequencies. Remember, evolution operates on the population level, natural selection operates on the individual. As individuals in the population inherit genes from one generation to the next, subtle changes in the genes are reflective of changes over time. Scientists can compare the amino acid sequence of organisms to better understand how those organisms are related. Now remember, the amino acid sequences that are put together by those codons in the DNA make proteins. So when scientists are studying the amino acid sequences, what they're really studying is the instructions for how a protein gets made, and then comparing those instructions to instructions in other individuals. So in most cases, the more closely related two organisms are, the more similar their amino acid sequence. The opposite is true as well. Organisms that are not closely related do not have as much similarity in their amino acid sequences. Remember the codons in DNA when we went A to C or A to T and C to G, right? And then when you had 3 of those nitrogenous bases together, that coded for an amino acid. So it's that DNA sequence and the amino acid sequence that scientists are studying, and then they compare 2 different organisms. So when you're comparing DNA evidence, number 1, the theory of evolution states that an organism's characteristics, including its DNA sequence, arose from similar characteristics in the organism's ancestors. When 2 or more species share chemical characteristics, the relationship may indicate a common ancestor. In other words, if they have a lot of DNA in common, they probably have a common ancestor. Scientists determine relationships between species by comparing the structure and sequence of their proteins. Sequence data can indicate how closely related different groups of organisms are. Comparing the amino acid sequence of similar proteins in different organisms helps scientists track evolutionary relationships. So I want to go back 2 slides. Look at this graph here. We have 3 different organisms. We have organism A, organism B, organism C, and organism D. The number of differences in amino acid sequences from organism A is this column. So in other words, B has 3 amino acid sequence differences. Organism C has 5 differences from A, and organism D only has 1 difference from A. So what that's going to tell you is that organism D is more closely related to organism A than the other 2. This one has 3 differences from A, this one has 5 differences from A, D only has 1 difference, and so therefore they're more closely related, A and D. Now, this is a phylogenetic tree, and what scientists do is they use DNA evidence to put together, They use DNA evidence to put together this thing called a phylogenetic tree, and basically it just shows you how organisms are more closely related or less closely related to each other. So the closer they are together on the phylogenetic tree, that just means they share more DNA. They share more of those sequences, similar sequences. So you can see a human is really far away from a frog, right, on this phylogenetic tree. So that means that they are not as closely related as, say, a human or a rhesus monkey. Okay, so that's what a phylogenetic tree does. It shows how closely related organisms are based on their amino acid sequencing. So here we go. I just wanted to show this to you. I thought this was really neat. This is the concept map from our last lesson, 205 and 206, showing that there is scientific evidence that supports the theory of evolution, and we could study comparative embryology, comparative anatomy, and vestigial structures. Remember, vestigial structures are those structures that still exist, but they don't really serve a purpose anymore, indicating that they may have in the past in a common ancestor. And then this is today's concept map, and it's showing here that DNA comparison, so comparing DNA, provides evidence for evolution, shows the relationship among organisms, and can be used as a molecular clock. And in lesson 2.08, when you read that, you're going to learn more about the fossil record, which provides evidence of the origin of life, change over time, evolution, and extinction and speciation. So the 3 concept maps from the lessons we did in our last class and today all show and are giving you an idea of the evidence that's out there to support the theory of evolution. So let's go ahead and move on to lesson 208, Evolution and Earth History. Again, the fossil record provides evidence of the origin of life, change over time, otherwise known as evolution, and extinction and speciation. If you could turn back the clock to a time before there was life on Earth, you'd see a very different view of the planet. Early in Earth's history, evidence indicates that there were no trees, grass, or flowers. There were no insects, birds, frogs, or people. The atmosphere was also quite different from the one you're familiar with. Back then, there was very little oxygen gas. Scientists argue that the first organisms on Earth were anaerobic. That is, their metabolism did not require oxygen. When the first photosynthetic organisms began to produce oxygen, the concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere began to increase. Scientists think that the atmosphere of early Earth contained very little oxygen gas, and when photosynthesis evolved, oxygen levels in the atmosphere began to increase. The first evidence of life, scientists have discovered 3.5 million year old fossils found in Western Australia. They are cyanobacteria fossils, and they're called stromatolites, and they're built by trapping sediments from the soil, and over time they fossilize. So they're fossilized bacteria is what they are. Evolution and Earth history. According to scientific thought, a single-cell organism is the most likely ancestor of all life on Earth. Single-cell prokaryote, not eukaryote. The fossil record provides scientific evidence that life on Earth has changed over time. Fossils provide information about the chronological order in which organisms lived. The fossil record contains information about the rise of new species and the extinction of others. The fossil record contains many transitional forms. That information is consistent with the view that species evolved over time. We're going to take a look at this picture, which I think is super little bit bigger here. It's a little blurry, but I think we can get through it. Four-legged mammals are thought to be the ancestors of modern whales. Scientists think that the earliest land-based animals developed into amphibious animals, then sea creatures, and ultimately whales. These images show the whale fossil record, along with an interpretation of how each animal might have looked. So we have the fossil record, right? So we have this fossil, we have this fossil, and of course we have whale fossils, and you can see that vestigial structure right there. That's that whale pelvic bone, the hip bone, that they no longer need, right? Because the whale doesn't need legs, and so what happened is the legs kind of over time, as the whale didn't need legs, the DNA sequencing for the formation of legs kind of left the DNA, instructions of the whales over time, and the tail instead, because all, vertebrates have a tail, some just don't have a long tail. So over time, the tail got longer and the legs disappeared, but there's still those hip bones there. Those are vestigial structures. So you can see about 60 million years ago, here's this four-legged creature that, evolved into this creature that looks more like a seal, right? It's starting to look like a seal. And then we have this creature about 40 million years ago, and then present day whales. So this is kind of the evolution, or what scientists believe to be the evolution of the whale. Now look how long it takes, right? That's a long time. So evolution takes time. And then finally, the fossil record preserves information about the evolutionary history of life on Earth and how the Earth's environment has changed over time.